Alright, so the build-up to the Constitution. I'm going to look at several of the events that led to the creation of our Constitution here in the United States. So let's get started. So we started off with the League of Friendship. Not really that great of a name, if you ask me, but then it really is. That quote comes from the Articles of Confederation. It sort of is establishing the 13 states as a league of friendship. And this video here kind of explains in more detail or different detail if you'd like to check that out. And so the Articles of Confederation, they did some things well. They negotiated the Treaty of the Revolution. They negotiated the Northwest Ordinance, as well as setting the precedent of federalism. And federalism is going to be a big part of this unit, and it's definitely something we want to make sure we understand because it comes up on the AP test. So we'll talk about it in more detail later on, and one of your assignments in Schoology also deals with federalism. But there were a lot of problems with the Articles of Confederation, and they didn't really work that well. So some of the facts: states had between 2 and 7 representatives. There was no president, no courts. Each state got 1 vote, so the representatives from the state had to agree on what they were going to do, and then the state would vote. You had a national legislature, which was strictly limited. It couldn't levy taxes. They were afraid of a tyrannical king. And then it also couldn't regulate commerce. And these are going to be some things we'll see again later on in the slides. It was a one-chamber or unicameral legislature. And then again, you needed unanimous consent, which it's ridiculous to think that all 13 states were going to agree on something. So it was pretty unproductive and inefficient. Some other limitations: it couldn't draft soldiers or tax citizens. The inability to tax made it pretty difficult to pay on the debt. It couldn't control interstate trade. There was no Supreme Court to interpret the law, no executive to enforce the law, and then no national currency. And then again, you needed unanimity? I don't know. You needed unanimous consent. So had some problems. So take a second and look at this image. Make some observations. So maybe you notice something back here, which may allow you to infer what this might be. This would be a courthouse, and so this is a picture of what's known as Shays' Rebellion. And Daniel Shays was a captain in the army during the Revolutionary War. He was a farmer in Massachusetts. And so Shays' Rebellion is caused by mainly by post-war debt. And there were some reasons for the debt. Basically, what you have is you've got people are unable to pay their debt, and they would get thrown into debtor's jail. And so these are people that fought in the Revolutionary War. They fought to free us from the oppression of the British, and now because they're unable to pay their taxes, they're being thrown in jail. And there's no way they're going to be able to pay their taxes from jail, so they're going to be left to unable to pay, which doesn't really make sense to me, because if you were trying to collect that debt, there's no way you're going to be able to get it, so you're kind of screwing yourself by throwing these guys in jail. Anyway, some of the reasons: you have a bad harvest that year. It was a cold, wet summer, so the crops didn't grow very well. So the shortage of crops made it so that it was difficult to sell at the market. And then you also have runaway inflation. All 13 states have their own form of currency. They've all got tariffs on each other. They're printing ridiculous amounts of currency, so that has virtually no value. And so you have runaway inflation between the states. And then a third thing, and I don't know that this is necessarily the kind of thing you'd take too much time describing in an AP test, but I do think it's interesting because I think it outlines some of the entrepreneurship that comes with being an American. And so kind of, they were shrewd business people, the farmers, and a lot of them took out loans to buy more land, more property, and more equipment so that they could farm. Because there were two armies, and then when the French came, there's three armies needing food, and so they figure if we can increase our land, we can increase how much we can grow, which means we can sell more, which means we can earn more money. And it's pretty shrewd of them to think that. But then when the war ends, they're left unable to pay that debt because there isn't the same amount of buyers in the market, and so those people end up not doing so well and being thrown into debtor's jail. So Captain Daniel Shays, as I mentioned before, leads a series of attacks, and that's what this picture is showing us. An attack on the courthouse. Basically, they would arrest somebody that had been a soldier in the war, and they'd be in court, and Daniel Shays and his rebels would go and essentially intimidate the court to not host the session, and so the person couldn't be thrown in jail, and they would more or less be free to go. And so he goes around and he's going all over Massachusetts doing this, and his numbers grow. There's a bit of discretion on how many he had. I'm going to say 4,000, but you'll probably read different numbers depending on what source you use. And so again, the goal is to prevent these foreclosures on the farms. And so eventually his army grows, and he goes to sack an armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. I don't think that's the same Springfield where the Simpsons live. I'm convinced that they're in Springfield, Illinois. But you'd have to watch the Simpsons to determine that. Anyway, so his army grows. He goes to sack this armory in Massachusetts, and their plan is to flank the armory. The Massachusetts militia gets wind of the plan and is able to stop it. But the uprising and the unrest kind of lets the government know, hey, we better address this. This isn't something that we can just take lightly. And so essentially the problem in Massachusetts is a problem. It's not unique to Massachusetts. You see it in a lot of parts of the country, and it's this east versus west. In the west, you have your rural farmers, and they're working hard to grow their crops. And not to say that the eastern business people aren't working hard, but they're making a lot of money due to the tariffs and the way the system is set up. The lack of regulation on interstate commerce and things like that. And so they're doing well and not really seeing to the needs of the people in the western areas. And so this kind of makes the government say, hold on, we better take a step back and look at this. And that kind of leads us to our Constitutional Convention. And so there's several proposals, and I'm going to kind of give you the expedited overview of these. First, we've got the Virginia Plan, very popular. Edmund Randolph, and I'm pretty sure it was James Madison. I think I only included Randolph because James Madison, the father of the Constitution, we're going to see him a ton over the next couple of weeks. So double check, but I think he was also one of the writers of the Virginia Plan. And some of the things that are outlined are a bicameral legislature or a two-house legislature, proportional representation, meaning the number of citizens, the number of people in your state would establish how much representation you get in Congress, and then this separation of power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. And so then we have our smaller states like New Jersey, guys like William Patterson, who realized, oh crap, we better do something or we're not going to have any power. The number of people in Virginia far outweighs the number of people in New Jersey, and so they quickly scramble and draft their own plan, known as the New Jersey Plan. There's several big things. One of the common things, or most common things that gets discussed, is the equal representation. where each state would get the same number of representatives as opposed to the Virginia plan, which was proportional. Another important piece here is Congress's ability to levy taxes. It's impossible to run a government if it can't raise money because it needs to be able to spend money in order to do things. Federal judges would serve for life, and then federal laws would be sort of the supreme law of the land. And so states could pass their own law, but when there is an issue between states and between people in states, the federal laws would reign supreme. And that's going to be a part of this federalism piece that we're going to look at in more detail later on in the unit. Roger Sherman, just beautiful man. I'm convinced that he's a ghost. That's a frightening picture. But Roger Sherman, he is one of the authors, along with Oliver Ellsworth. They are of Connecticut, and they draft the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise. And it basically takes the best parts of both the Virginia and the New Jersey plan and blends them into one. It agrees that we should have a bicameral legislature, the two-house legislature, but it proposes one house be proportionally represented, the other be equally represented. Senators would be elected by the state legislature, and this is going to be another check on the people, which you may kind of remember me mentioning in the earlier video, to help keep from the rule of the majority and the tyranny of the majority. The separation of power, or kind of the checks and balances system between the, it kind of establishes the separation of power between state governments and federal governments, but also between the branches of government. It does establish judges serving for life. Why would it be significant that judges would be able to serve for life? And hopefully one of the things you considered or thought about was that it frees them from politics. And so it gives judges the ability to make the right decision regardless of potential political backlash. Congress can regulate commerce and taxes. Again, a major problem were these excessive tariffs between states. It's hard for a nation to function when it can't even do business with itself. And so the federal government will be in charge of that. So then how does this, take a second and think about how this gives power to small states, or more power to small states. And hopefully you kind of got to the idea that it disproportionately represents small states, because if you're a state with 10,000 people, you get 2 senators, and if you're a state with 100,000 people, you get 2 senators. And so you're going to have more access to those government officials. Another major controversy during this period is what's known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. And this Three-Fifths Compromise is addressing the issue of slavery. And one of the things we're going to look at when we look at the Constitution is where slavery is mentioned throughout the Constitution. And they, for better or worse, the Founding Fathers almost deferred on the issue. There's a few clauses that address slavery that is really more or less them kind of saying, you know what, we were really able to come to much of an agreement. We're going to leave it for later generations to deal with. And it really does. It is one of the main issues up until the Civil War. Is slavery. And so how to count slaves. The South wants them to be counted toward their population for representation. And states were taxed on population as well, and so the North's like, okay, then you're going to have to pay taxes on them. And the South's like, well, we don't really want to pay taxes on them because they're not really people. And the North's like, well, if they're not people, then why would they count towards your representation? And so it kind of goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so it gets messy, and eventually James Madison decides, you know what, we're just if we count them as 3/5 of a person, how about that? And everybody kind of agreed there. So I would say this is a stain and a scar on American history, but it was an issue, and clearly it was difficult to resolve, because it was, almost 100 years later. There was probably the bloodiest war in American history was fought over it.